I want to read a little bit from this very informative piece. You write, narratives collected of formerly enslaved people reveal the horrors of massive starvation of liberated black people seeking shelter in burned out buildings and scrounging for food. With the advent of emancipation, writes the historian Kerry Merritt, blacks became the only race in the U.S. ever to start out as an entire people with close to zero capital. To this day, the only Americans who have ever received government restitution for slavery were white enslavers in Washington, D.C., who were compensated for the loss of human property. I don't think a lot of people realize that. And so I wonder if you could tell us you could list some of the programs throughout America's history that black people were excluded from that actually helped white people build wealth.
Sure, and thank you for talking about this subject today, because the history we've been taught about slavery and the end of slavery and what followed is so sanitized that I think so much of the opposition to the idea of reparations is because most Americans really don't know. So we know at the same time that the federal government turned away from the idea of giving formerly enslaved people 40 acres of land to try to work to become independent. It was also enacting the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act gave tens of millions of acres to white Americans. It also was used as a tool to entice white immigrants to come to the United States. Fully about 10% of all American land was given away to white settlers. Black people were almost completely excluded from that. Black people were excluded from when the federal government got into the business of insuring home loans, which really built the white middle class. 98% of those home loans between 1933 and 1962 went to white Americans, and we know that that was the largest driver of the creation of the middle class. Black Americans were left out of the majority of Black Americans were left out of the Social Security when it was first passed in the New Deal. And so for the first 35 years of Social Security, the majority of Black Americans did not qualify. So we saw this with the GI Bill. Black GIs came back from the war. They were able to get the GI Bill, but were not able to use it often to buy homes in white-only suburbs that were being subsidized by the federal government. So we've seen again and again that the government has provided really affirmative action programs for white Americans that Black Americans were not allowed to participate in. And those programs built what we now see as a wealth gap that is 10 to 1 for white households over Black households.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that wealth gap. You write in this piece, the racial wealth gap is about the same as it was in the 1950s, and yet most Americans are in the almost pathological denial about the depth of Black financial struggle. The 2019 Yale study called The Misperception of Racial Economic Inequality found that Americans believe that Black households hold $90 in wealth for every $100 held by white households. The actual amount is $10. So curious, how does that misperception affect them?
Well, one, I think a lot of Americans don't understand the difference between income and wealth. And so they see Black people earning a good income and assume that that means Black people also hold wealth. But income is your paycheck. Wealth is your assets. And those tend to be accumulated over time and passed down from generation to generation. And even high income Black Americans actually have very little wealth. How that affects them then is, again, this inability to have empathy for the financial circumstance of Black Americans. They assume that Black people live largely like they do, which means that Black people have money in the bank if there's a catastrophe, that Black people can purchase homes in any neighborhood that their income would say that they could afford, that Black people should be able to help send their children to college. And it's just simply not the truth. So again, I think because we don't understand the depth of Black financial struggle, but also how much it was created by our federal, state, and local governments,